The United Nations reports global fertility has plunged from nearly 5 children per woman in 1950 to about 2.3 today. In just a few generations, that shift has turned baby-filled suburbs into countries where playgrounds lie quiet and birth cohorts shrink year after year. We'll trace the slow, relentless arc from post-war baby booms to modern cities, rising living costs, expanded education, and contraception. That official data show reshaped reproductive choices around the world. Using UN and national statistics, expert analysis, and the human stories behind the numbers, this film explains why aging populations, shrinking workforces, and strained social systems are no longer projections but present realities. Watch to understand how policy, culture, and economics produced the last generation and what concrete options remain to rewrite the story. The silence of the cradles. Global fertility has trended toward and in many places fallen below the replacement level of roughly 2.1 children per woman, a shift documented by the United Nations World Population Prospects and discussed across OECD reporting. Demographers noted that as fertility rates slipped and life expectancy rose, the age structure of societies altered and the balance between dependents and working-age adults tightened, prompting immediate policy attention. Official agencies tracked these shifts as more than demographic footnotes. They became metrics driving immigration quotas, pension recalculations, and public health planning. The story unfolds from that arithmetic. At first, the change was incremental. Maternity wards with fewer births per month, local public health formularies adjusting projection charts. But the cumulative effect became unmistakable. Governments moved to respond with widely reported pronatalist measures, expanded parental leave and childcare subsidies in countries cited by the OECD, cash incentives and housing support in others, and campaigns to encourage earlier family formation. International health bodies, including the World Health Organization, emphasized access to reproductive services and flagged infertility as a public health concern, which in turn increased demand for assisted reproductive technologies in clinics that were simultaneously seeing changing client profiles. Yet official evaluations, including policy reviews by supranational organizations, found that these measures often slowed decline without restoring previous birth cohorts. Socioeconomic drivers documented by agencies, such as the UN and OECD, threaded through the narrative. Urbanization, rising educational attainment among women, the increasing cost of housing and childcare, and expanded access to contraception and family planning services were repeatedly cited in official analyses as key contributors to sustained lower fertility. Surveys conducted by recognized research centers reinforced those findings. Economic uncertainty and career considerations featured prominently in the reasons people gave for delaying or foregoing parenthood. Public records of labor force participation and dependency ratios recorded the downstream effects. Workforce shortages in certain sectors, fiscal pressure on pension systems, and shifting healthcare demand as populations aged. As years passed, the plot tightened around visible social change. Municipal budgets reallocated funds from school expansion to elder care. Some rural districts consolidated schools as enrollment figures fell. Urban parks once crowded with strollers thinned during midweek hours. Migration policies were adjusted in many official immigration plans to partially offset population shortfalls, and statistical agencies began publishing scenarios that emphasized the importance of net migration for labor force sustainability. Despite policy interventions and documented increases in assisted reproduction in clinic reports, births did not rebound to former levels in several countries, and public planning documents started using language like population stabilization rather than growth. In the quiet that followed, the absence of newborns became both a demographic fact recorded in official datasets and a cultural motif. Nurseries repurposed, pediatric wings downsized, and the soft hum of infant monitors an increasingly rare sound. Birth rates are dropping below replacement levels worldwide. Schools are closing, playgrounds are emptying, and cities are aging. For the first time, humanity is shrinking not by disaster, but by choice, leading to a world where the laughter of children becomes a rare memory. United Nations population assessments show that the global average number of children per woman has fallen toward, and in many places below, the threshold needed to maintain population size, about 2.1 children per woman. Official analyses from a UN population division, the OECD, and the World Bank collectively tie this decline to widespread access to contraception, rising educational attainment for women, and urbanization alongside economic pressures that make child-rearing more costly. Fertility rates vary widely, but in numerous countries the figure sits well under replacement levels, creating a demographic tide that has been building steadily over recent decades. What began as gradual declines in family size accelerated as social norms shifted and structural incentives lagged. Governments and international agencies documented a sequence. First, falling birth rates in wealthier countries. Then, decline spreading to middle-income nations as labor markets and housing markets changed. And finally, uneven demographic transitions in lower-income regions as education and access to reproductive health care expanded. Official research from the OECD and UN highlights how delayed marriage, increased female labor participation, and persistent housing and child care costs turned family planning into a deliberate economic decision for many couples. The result was not catastrophe, but choice, an aggregate of millions of private decisions that reshaped national populations. Schools, once central to neighborhood life, began to reflect that reshaping. Education ministries and municipal reports from countries with pronounced declines show school consolidations, closures, and mergers as student rolls shrank. Rural districts have been especially hard hit, with entire elementary schools shuttered and buses running longer routes to collect the remaining pupils. In urban centers, formerly bustling schoolyards and after-school programs scaled back. Classrooms were repurposed as adult education spaces. Healthcare clinics are left empty. These shifts are documented in municipal planning documents and education statistics compiled by national governments and international agencies. Playgrounds and child care centers tell a parallel story. Local government audits and urban planning studies note playground maintenance budgets cut because usage dropped, while operators of private daycare centers report lower enrollment and rising per-child costs. Public parks in some neighborhoods that once echoed with small voices now host Tai Chi or groups for older adults during the day. Demographic data from national statistical offices corroborate these patterns by showing fewer children in cohorts entering kindergarten and primary school year after year. Cities themselves have been remade as populations age. Economic analyses from the World Bank and labor assessments by the International Labor Organization reveal a tightening workforce and a rising dependency ratio in many nations, pressuring pension systems and healthcare infrastructure. Urban planners and local governments have documented the conversion of family-sized apartments into smaller units for singles or the elderly, and municipal services have shifted toward geriatric care, accessible transportation, and age-friendly public spaces. In some places, vacant homes and declining school districts create visible signs of demographic change, while migration flows, both internal and international, partly offset declines but do not erase the broader trend. Policy responses have been varied and, in many cases, only partially effective. Governments have tried incentives, cash bonuses, parental leave expansions, subsidized childcare, with mixed results, as shown in policy evaluations from the OECD and national studies. Some measures temporarily alter timing of births rather than long-term fertility levels. Other responses focus on adaptation, redesigning cities for older residents, retraining older workers, and leaning on automation to sustain productivity. These adaptations are reflected in public budgets and labor market statistics that increasingly allocate resources toward elder care and technology investments rather than school expansions. Culturally, the absence of children reshapes everyday life in subtle and profound ways. Community calendars shift from school plays and youth sports to workshops and clubs for older adults. Seasonal celebrations become quieter. Intergenerational interactions reduce in frequency. The cumulative data from health ministries education departments, and urban planning agencies show not only numerical decline, but a transformation in public life. Less space taken up by strollers and more by mobility aids, fewer PDA meetings, and more forums on long-term care. What once seemed a background demographic trend has moved center stage, altering how neighborhoods are organized, how economies plan for labor and welfare, and how societies remember the commonplace sound of children's laughter. The Great Inversion. Global birth rates slipped below the replacement threshold of roughly 2.1 children per woman across large swaths of the world, a demographic shift tracked by the United Nations and highlighted in reports by the World Bank and OECD. The World Health Organization projected that the number of people aged 60 and over would continue to climb steeply, forecasting 1 in 6 people globally would be 60 or older by 2030, and that the older population could double to about 2.1 billion by mid-century. Public records from national statistical offices reinforced these international summaries. School enrollment figures fell in dozens of countries, and municipal budgets began reflecting a steady tilt from child services toward elder care. Small towns that once expanded playgrounds started repurposing them into exercise parks for seniors. Entire elementary schools consolidated as classrooms when in use. The Great Inversion unfolded not as a single catastrophe, but as a cascade of policy shifts, market responses, and civic reordering that accelerated over years. Governments moved from incentivizing childbirth to managing the consequences of fewer children. Pension systems were recalibrated, sometimes by raising retirement ages. Health ministries redirected capital toward chronic care and geriatric specialties, and urban planners redesigned public transit to prioritize accessibility over routes to schools. The IMF and OECD repeatedly warned that aging populations would depress labor force growth and strain public finances, prompting fiscal debates at the highest levels. Private actors reacted too. Insurers restructured products for longer lifespans. Banks adjusted mortgage terms for older homeowners, and employers retooled workforces toward automation and flexible scheduling to compensate for shrinking applicant pools. Concrete examples punctuated the narrative. In education, school district reports documented closures and district consolidations as student counts declined, while demographic appendices in municipal budgets showed reallocations from playground maintenance to home care subsidies. Hospitals and clinics published capacity plans that shifted investment into outpatient geriatrics and palliative care. Health workforce forecasts from ministries showed surges in demand for nurses and long-term care aides, even as fewer young people entered these professions. Industry statistics recorded increased capital expenditure on robotics and automation in manufacturing and logistics to offset labor shortages, and transportation authorities piloted autonomous shuttles to maintain low-demand routes that could no longer support full-size buses staffed by drivers. Social and political consequences threaded through everyday life. Voting patterns changed as older cohorts, now a larger share of the electorate, pressed for security in pensions and healthcare funding, altering policy priorities in parliaments and city councils. Immigration policies were debated as pragmatic remedies. Labor ministries used official migration data to design targeted worker programs and skill recognition frameworks to integrate migrants into sectors facing acute shortages. Meanwhile, community groups documented cultural shifts, fewer children's festivals, and more intergenerational centers, more housing conversions where former family homes were adapted with accessibility lifts, and commercial corridors that exchanged toy stores for pharmacies and mobility clinics. The Great Inversion thus revealed itself through official statistics and lived realities alike. A slow, measurable flipping of societal investments and everyday rhythms driven by demographic facts verified by international agencies and national datasets. The economic pyramid is flipping. A shrinking youth workforce cannot sustain a massive aging population, causing pension and healthcare systems to buckle. We are entering the era of ghost economies, plenty of jobs but no people left to do them. The United Nations projects that by mid-century, roughly 1 in 6 people worldwide will be 65 or older, a shift born of steadily rising life expectancy and a dramatic fall in fertility, Global births per woman have declined from roughly 5 to about 2.4 over the past half-century, according to World Bank data. These are not abstract trends. They reshape labor pools, tax bases, and the very structure of social insurance systems. Governments that built pay-as-you-go pensions and broad public health care nets when the worker-to-retiree ratio was high now find those ratios compressing fast. Pension systems that once seemed actuarially sound came under strain as the cohort that paid into them shrank relative to those drawing benefits. After eras of expansive public pensions and health coverage, many economies turned to borrowing, higher payroll taxes, or benefit reductions. The International Monetary Fund and the OECD have repeatedly warned that aging will raise public spending pressures and could increase budget deficits unless policy adjustments are made. Sharp reforms help some countries temporarily, but reforms can be politically painful, and the demographic momentum often overwhelms the incremental fixes. Labor markets told the human side of the story. Businesses across care, construction, hospitality, and agriculture began reporting persistent vacancy rates and recruitment failures. In advanced economies with the oldest populations like Japan, where the share of people aged 65 and over is among the world's highest, rural towns emptied, services shuttered, and entire supply chains tightened because replacement workers were simply not there. Shortages weren't uniform. Urban centers could still draw migrants, while peripheral regions turned into slow-moving economic ghosts. The result? Jobs existed in abundance on paper, but fewer people were available or willing to fill them. Public finances buckled under a double burden: more spending on pensions and health care, and less revenue growth from wages and consumption. National trustees and fiscal monitors began issuing stark assessments that trust funds and healthcare financing mechanisms would face shortfalls if nothing changed. Policymakers tried many responses: raising retirement ages, tightening benefits indexing, recruiting migrants, and pouring money into automation. Each measure helped a bit. None was a silver bullet. Automation raised productivity in factories, but it could not easily replace the personal labor needed in elder care, home nursing, or the small businesses that relied on local employees. The economic geography of decline became visible. Towns with boarded storefronts, clinics stretched thin, schools consolidated because there were no children to fill classrooms. These were not isolated anecdotes, but verifiable patterns in national statistics and municipal registries. In some regions, the number of vacant homes and abandoned properties climbed in official surveys, while local tax bases shrank. The mismatch between available work and available workers created an emergent phenomenon economists began calling ghost economies, sectors with steady demand and chronic understaffing, where wages rose in some pockets, but productivity and service coverage fell overall. Policy debates shifted from whether aging mattered to how to manage the cascade of consequences. Immigration became a contested lever. It eased shortages in places that accepted migrants but provoked political backlash elsewhere. Labor market reforms and incentives for higher female and older worker participation showed modest gains where institutions supported childcare and lifelong training. Still, international organizations emphasized that demographic trends would impose lasting structural adjustments on public budgets and labor markets. The era ahead, they warned, will be defined less by cyclical unemployment and more by persistent gaps: jobs that exist, revenues that are forecasted, and societies strained by too few hands to sustain them. The death of tomorrow. According to United Nations and World Health Organization analyses, global fertility trends slipped well below the replacement threshold of roughly 2.1 children per woman in many countries, and infertility affects about 15% of couples worldwide. Reports from the OECD and UNESCO documented falling school enrollments and shrinking cohorts entering the workforce, while World Bank and IMF briefs warned of mounting dependency ratios and economic headwinds. Local health systems registered a steady decline in live births, and clinics reported rising demand for assisted reproductive technologies that remained costly and unevenly accessible. At first, the change was muted, A slow thinning of nursery wards and one-room primary schools consolidated into two. Policymakers launched familiar remedies: cash bonuses, extended parental leave, subsidized childcare, and fertility clinics expanded with public funds. The measures produced isolated upticks in births in some regions. But OECD reviews found the overall effect to be short-lived when cultural and economic pressures remained unaddressed. Fertility clinics filled with couples who could afford treatment, while marginalized communities saw dwindling access to reproductive services. Hospitals that once ran 3 shifts for newborn care began to repurpose labor and delivery units. Rural towns emptied faster than projections had allowed, and municipalities closed schools or converted them to elder care centers. Short sentences hit harder now. Factories reported chronic hiring shortfalls. Sectors reliant on young workers, construction, early childhood education, seasonal agriculture, faced repeated stoppages. The World Bank and IMF analyses were stark. Long-term growth projections dimmed without a renewed base of young consumers and workers to sustain pensions and public services. Communities reacted abruptly. Immigration policies loosened in many countries as governments sought to import labor, while automation investments accelerated to replace missing workers. At the same time, social networks frayed. Surveys cited by public health agencies recorded rising loneliness among older adults whose families no longer grew, and mental health services struggled to adapt to new patterns of intergenerational isolation. Short-term fiscal relief for families could not instantly rewrite cultural norms about work, childbearing, and gender roles, and human behavior proved resilient against purely financial nudges. The arc of events, traced in official reports and on-the-ground records, shows policy, technology, and demography colliding. United Nations briefs continued to stress comprehensive approaches, expanding equitable reproductive health care, supporting gender equality in the workplace, making childcare affordable and culturally accessible, and calibrating migration strategies. In the aftermath, the narrative was not a single catastrophe, but a cascade of decisions and inactions, each documented by public agencies, each shaping the daily reality of fewer cradles, fewer classrooms, and a mounting question of how societies would sustain themselves when tomorrow's youngest never arrived. A world without children is a world without a why. When the generational link breaks, the drive for innovation and the preservation of culture vanish. Humanity risks becoming a caretaker species, obsessed with its past because it no longer has a stake in the future. Global fertility has fallen to levels that demographers now describe as unprecedented. According to the United Nations World Population Prospects, the average number of births per woman has dropped to around the threshold that separates population growth from decline, and a majority of countries now record below replacement fertility. This shift did not arrive overnight. It followed decades of reliable trends: improvements in child survival and public health, greater access to contraception across low- and middle-income countries, and rising educational attainment for women. Factors repeatedly highlighted by the World Bank and UN agencies as primary drivers of shrinking family size. The World Health Organization also notes that infertility affects roughly 1 in 6 couples globally, adding a medical constraint to demographic shifts that were already reshaping expectation and behavior. Early stages of the plot unfolded quietly. Urbanization concentrated people in high-cost centers where raising children became a heavier financial burden. Governments and international organizations, including the OECD and World Bank, documented correlations between housing and childcare costs and postponed parenthood. Surveys by Pew Research and other social researchers recorded a cultural turn. Younger adults frequently cited economic insecurity, career pressures, and environmental concerns as reasons to delay or forego children. At the same time, reproductive technologies expanded access for some, but could not scale to reverse population-wide declines. Assisted reproductive treatments remained expensive and unevenly available, leaving systemic shortages in birth rates, even where individual desire for children persisted. As cohorts aged and birth cohorts shrank, the second act emerged: Institutions and economies adapted to an older population. Pension systems faced strain and labor markets restructured. Automation and higher labor force participation among older adults partially offset shortfalls. But fewer young people meant fewer consumers of tomorrow's goods and services, fewer entrants into risky startups, and a smaller pool of fresh perspectives in science and the arts. Countries already flagged by UN reports for rapid aging. Places like Japan, Italy, and South Korea turn into laboratories for policies that range from prenatalist incentives to automation subsidies. Many of those policy interventions produced marginal increases at best, while structural, cultural, and economic drivers continued to push fertility downward. Then came the cultural response, stark and almost architectural in its intensity. International heritage organizations, such as UNESCO, documented accelerating efforts to record, digitize, and conserve traditions as practitioners aged and, in some cases, passed on without transmission. Museums, national archives, and scientific repositories swelled their budgets for preservation. Seed vaults like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault and an expanding universe of biobanks and digital cultural repositories became stand-ins for living communities. The narrative quality of life shifted toward caretaking. Research centers prioritized maintenance, conservation biology, archival science, long-term care technology, over speculative, future-oriented ventures. The focus narrowed from building new futures to keeping the past intelligible. Practical consequences multiplied. Educational systems consolidated. Classrooms that had once been hubs of future imagination became laboratories for intergenerational memory transmission. Labor markets produced more geriatric specialists and fewer pediatricians. Innovation pipelines altered. With declining youth cohorts, universities and industries reported fewer entrants into high-risk entrepreneurial paths, and the venture capital ecosystem recalibrated toward technologies that extended existing systems rather than overturning them. Official economic assessments and demographic projections signaled a world increasingly organized around sustaining what remained rather than creating what might come next. The human cost was not only institutional. Social narratives shifted from aspiration to stewardship. Where children once embodied a repository of deferred hope and an engine of moral argument for long-term action, their absence rewired public purpose. Grants and foundations redirected funds into conservation and remediation. Philanthropic language became backward-facing, and public discourse lamented legacy rather than call to tomorrow. The why that had propelled countless innovations, raising the next generation, leaving a better world for them, eroded. In its place rose a meticulous, often anxious commitment to memory and maintenance, a caretaking mode driven by official agencies, cultural institutions, and civic actors attempting to keep human achievements intact once there would be no inheritors to carry them forward. Decades of change brought us here. Global fertility has slid from roughly 5 children per woman in the mid-20th century to about 2.4 today, United Nations/World Bank, with a replacement level near 2.1. Dozens of countries now sit well below that line. Japan at roughly 1.3, South Korea under 1.0, and many Southern European nations around 1.2, and the UN projects a rapidly aging world. The share of older adults is on track to nearly double in coming decades. Those are the hard facts behind the images you've seen. You watched births fall, schools close, playgrounds grow quiet, and economies strain under fewer workers and more retirees. You saw the human choices behind the statistics, career pressures, rising living costs, shifting values, climate, and economic anxiety. This story is part policy problem, part cultural shift, part demographic reality, and it matters because it shapes our neighborhoods, pensions, health systems, and the simplest human future, whether there will be children at all. If this resonated, read the linked UN and World Bank reports, share this film, and speak up for policies that support families and futures. Join the conversation below. Your voice matters in decisions about childcare, immigration, labor policy, and science. In our next episode, we will probe solutions, proven family policies, migration strategies, In emerging technologies, experts, data, and stories that ask one question: will this be the last generation or the one that chose to change course?